morning, everybody. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael, managing editor at Bloomberg Opinion. And we're talking today about the big budget bill currently working its way through Congress. I believe as of this morning, the Senate had stayed up all night trying to get the votes together on this thing. They're still working on that as we speak. But we're talking today about what's inside the bill, how politically popular it is, and how it is forcing tough choices on some Republicans. I'm here today with David Drucker and Mary Ellen Klas, both Bloomberg Opinion political columnists. And we're going to start with a little bit of what's in this bill, because a survey that was out yesterday found that only half of Americans had even heard of the bill, and even fewer Americans realized what was in it. So, David, I thought we could start with you. What are some of the big, most important things in this bill, which has been changing and undergoing a lot of discussion and amendments as it's moved through both chambers?
Yeah, it's 900 plus pages, if I'm not mistaken. And I've been referring to it as a sort of policy omnibus bill, right? I mean, it's just like they've thrown in everything and the kitchen sink, as long as the Senate parliamentarian says that it meets the rules of this reconciliation process under the 1974 Budget Act. Some of the things people may not have heard, may have heard of, but I think are the biggest parts of the bill that they're going to focus on are, number one, a continuation of the tax cuts from the 2017 tax overhaul that Trump signed into law during his first term. And then you have new tax cuts. You have, under certain parameters, if you earn money from tips, if you're a server, if you work in the hospitality industry, things of that nature, you could get a tax cut. If you punch a clock and get paid, time and a half overtime or double time or whatever that is, when you get paid overtime under the law, that particular amount of money wouldn't get taxed. There's a tax cut for seniors related to their Social Security income. There's also, under certain parameters, a tax deduction that's brand new. If you purchase an American-made car, and there are certain, it can be complicated what constitutes an American-made car, even if it's fabricated in the United States. And then obviously for home high tax states, where you got a lot of state and local taxes, income taxes, property taxes, things like that, they're going to raise the cap on the federal deduction for those state and local taxes, commonly referred to as SALT, for a period. They're going to raise it from 10,000 to 40,000, we believe, but only for a period of a few years. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here, and then I'll kick it back, is in order to get at least 50 Republicans in the Senate out of 53, and then Vice President J.D. Vance would play the tiebreaker, there are a couple of amendments to watch. One is a special carve-out for Alaska, requested by Senator Lisa Murkowski, that would loosen some of the Medicaid cuts that are planned in this bill. That's a huge part of it, in order to try and save some money or not exacerbate the debt any more than the $3.3 trillion that's been projected. There are a lot of Medicaid cuts, but there's this thing that they're trying to do. It could be voted on momentarily, which would allow Alaska residents to escape some of this stuff. It reminds me of the Obamacare debate and the Cornhusker kickback, when Senator Ben Nelson, a Democrat, wanted a special carve out for Nebraska in exchange for his vote. And then finally, on the flip side, the budget hawks, Senator Rick Scott, Senator Ron Johnson, and a few others, want an amendment that would cancel the federal match for the Obamacare expansion after, I believe it's 2030, but sometime in the next decade. Right now, if in a sense you're somebody who's in the middle class, not necessarily poor, that's benefited from Medicaid expansion under Obamacare in the states that have embraced it, there's like a 90-10 federal match. And Scott, who is a budget hawk, is looking to reduce pressure on the debt, and this is an amendment he wants. So watch all of that. It's ongoing as we speak. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, what would you add to that? What are some of the key things you're watching in this bill?
Well, to me, the most significant thing, which I think has really deep repercussions, and the Senate Republicans have already lost the vote of Tom Tillis on this, is the giant cutbacks to Medicaid coverage. There are going to be deep cuts for people in long-term care facilities, in rural hospitals. But the biggest cuts really are those who are on the, relying on the Affordable Care Act provisions in the marketplace, and some of the children's health insurance programs. Those face enormous cuts, and they will affect every state, and really have a ripple effect in the healthcare system. So that's one of the deep cuts. The other provisions are, they're really gutting the Biden tax credits as it relates to clean energy, basically eliminating some of the clean energy incentives and potentially even adding new taxes on solar and wind projects. There are other things in there that are designed sort of for culture war related issues. They have an adoption tax credit. They're going to eliminate a firearms tax. They're also got some provisions for helping defund Planned Parenthood, for example, things like that. So it really is, as David said, it's an omnibus bill in many ways. It was intended just sort of to be a stopgap budget bill, but they've turned it into a major project, and it at this point is the biggest budget initiative Trump has ever attempted.
Yeah, and I mean, just to give a couple other examples of some of the details in the bill, I think you guys have hit the most important points. But there's a child tax credit that's expanded. There are these sort of baby bonds, savings accounts that they're calling Trump accounts. Excuse me. You mentioned the energy cuts. There is also, huge immigration spending increases proposed that would allow Trump needs that funding if he's going to do his mass deportation plan. But it would transform DHS and transform ICE into a much bigger law enforcement agency. So there's a lot of stuff in here. And I think that's one of the reasons it's been a little bit hard for the people to follow it. I think the other thing that's been tough for people to follow is just all the changes in permutation. So the House had this whole negotiation. Now the Senate parliamentarian, which is someone most people haven't even heard of, made a bunch of changes to the bill. And I thought maybe, David, you could kind of just help us kind of get our heads around why there's all these procedural gimmicks. Those are still ongoing. I don't know how Alaska gets a special carve out. I mean, I think to a lot of people that seems kind of crazy. But then you also have the parliamentarian stripping out a bunch of stuff that she said wasn't really budget related. And I wonder if you could just kind of help us get our heads around all of that.
Sure. And by the way, the border security components, money for the wall and stuff like that is a crucial part of this bill that really could have been broken out into its own reconciliation package. That's what Senate Majority Leader John Thune preferred, but House Speaker Mike Johnson thought it would be easier if the House, with its majority of less than a handful, would just go through this once. But just to give you an idea of the politics of this as of this morning, and then I will roll this into the procedural aspect. Vice President J.D. Vance tweeted that everything else, the CBO score, the proper baseline, the minutia of the Medicaid policy is immaterial compared to the ICE immigration enforcement provisions. So you know that they're struggling a little when they're basically saying, never mind all the goodies, focus on that goodie. But look, this is a very complicated process. Part of this is that increasingly over the last 25 years, Congress doesn't want to do its job, and they function like a parliament. Sarah, this is like you got a hole in your head because you've heard me say this so many times. But what that means is that whenever there's a majority and that party also has the White House, they've used this process that we call reconciliation, which allows you to sidestep the filibuster, right? The 60 vote threshold. But in exchange for that, and this is under the 1974 Budget Act, you can't just pass anything. Otherwise, the filibuster would be meaningless. You can only include measures that relate to taxing and spending. And the numbers, in a sense, they don't necessarily have to balance each other out, but there has to be a clear, tax provision or a clear spending provision. It's one of the reasons. And then, so you put all of these in this bill. And then naturally, as we've seen, and I first noticed this as a Capitol Hill reporter at the time with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, after Scott Brown won that open Senate seat because Senator Ted Kennedy had passed away, The Democrats in Obama's first term lost their 60 vote supermajority. All of a sudden, it's 59 votes. Well, what are you going to do? Because Scott Brown ran against Obamacare. Well, they said, we're not going to give up. We're going to do the rest of this. They had already passed a number of key, procedural. They'd made it part of the way there. We'll use reconciliation and we'll stretch the bounds of what can go in reconciliation. And parliamentarian ruled some stuff in, some stuff out. Anyway, this has continued into Trump's first term, into Biden's term. And so instead of trying to govern in a normal way where it may not be completely bipartisan, but it's a normal, regular order process with both parties contributing, they just opt for this reconciliation process, and they try and stuff it with as many policies as they can, even if they don't apply to even if they don't fit under the reconciliation process. The Senate parliamentarian, who can be overruled or fired, sifts through the bill and decides which is allowable and which is not. And I'll just close with this. It was in a sense, a permanent defunding of the Planned Parenthood line item. The parliamentarian ruled that you could do it if you do it for a year. Like there was a certain way in which a tax and spending measure, just to do it for a year, wasn't actually really policy. It was more about the numbers. So these are the sorts of things that happen. But one of the reasons I think this bill is so hard for people to understand and so unpopular at the moment is that even Republicans who are trying to pass it are criticizing it. Nobody likes it right now. They're all saying it's not good enough. So I think the question is, if they get there, I think they'll get there eventually. Does the messaging change and allow voters to embrace it more? Because at least somebody says it's good.
Yeah, on that political piece of it, a lot of the changes here will affect Trump's voters. The Medicaid cuts, as Steve Bannon said, a lot of MAGA is on Medicaid. A lot of the energy cuts that Mary Ellen had mentioned, a lot of those energy subsidies were going to red states and red districts. So Mary Ellen, I'm wondering, a lot of those districts are in the South, which you cover. You're dialing in today from Florida, and you cover the entire U.S. South for us. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on kind of, will voters in those states connect the dots back to this bill if they start to feel those changes, or will there be any political price to pay for the Republicans who are voting for this?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate David's good context there, because I do think it helps people. It helps to understand why this is such an unusual arrangement. If anybody follows a state legislative process, things don't get to happen like this. But when you talk about the impact, the Congressional Budget Office, which is sort of this nonpartisan wing of Congress that assesses what the actual costs of things are, it says that the bill will cause 11.8 million Americans to become uninsured. And as I mentioned, it's either because of the loss of Medicaid or losses from Medicaid coverage, just generally reducing the number of people eligible, adding new hurdles, or reducing the Affordable Care Act provisions. And the interesting thing is, while there are only 10 states that have not expanded Medicaid to be part of the Affordable Care Act, most of them are in the South. But the flip side is that those states also depend enormously on Medicaid, the other provisions. So Florida, for example, has an enormous Medicaid population, and probably some of the highest people who are in the affordable care marketplace, because there are so many low-wage workers in the state. So when you talk about what impacts these cuts will have, Medicaid serves low-income populations, states with high shares of people who are in poverty, states with aging populations. Those are the states that are going to feel the biggest impact of this, and many of them are in the South. And so the top 5 states that are going to have the biggest hit if these Medicaid cuts go through are New Mexico, Kentucky, Louisiana, South Carolina, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Those are states long known to have some demographics with some of the poorest people, struggling working families. And so the question will be, how do they bridge the gap? And it's very likely that the onus will be on these states to either bridge the gap or just, leave it with people without these services. The other thing that is very interesting is the energy incentives. During the Biden administration and their infrastructure projects, they really targeted a lot of southern states for building battery plants, building solar manufacturing. Many components of the clean energy revolution have been, built in these southern states. And with the repeal of many of these incentives, that's going to leave the question of where do those manufacturing plants go, and whether they even stay in business. And so we have not heard a lot of pushback from southern state governors about this publicly, but I would suspect there is a lot of talk going on. And as we've mentioned, this bill, if it passes in the Senate, it's now got to go to the House. And so that's the next step to put pressure on, to making a deal to eliminate some of these onerous things that really do affect states, especially in the South.
Yeah. David, you are a longtime student of the Republican Party and that sort of the coalitional politics that they practice. Trump is very popular, undoubtedly, with Republican voters. So undoubtedly, they would like to see their guy's bill pass. But I do wonder if you see kind of, I don't know, tensions in the coalition when you think about some of these trade-offs that Republican senators and Congress people are having to make.
Well, I mean, I think we see tension with Republican members of Congress who are concerned about how this is going to impact their states and their districts and therefore their political standing. But, President Trump has been able to avoid blame for anything Congress does or Republicans in Congress do, even when they're doing what he told them to do. And so, the scenario that I could see happening, let's just say let's presuppose for the sake of argument that the bill passes, and despite all the cheerleading and fanfare, Republican voters in these states where, president has a lot of support, where people vote Republican almost all the time, decide that this bill is a raw deal that broke the promise about not cutting health care and everything else. They're more likely to blame Republicans in Congress for not listening to Trump, even though Trump signed the bill. And so for Trump, Trump like all presidents, Trump wants this. It's the centerpiece of his agenda. It has so many components of the proposals that he ran on in 2024. And individually, so many of these things are either popular or at least popular within the Republican Party. And so what they're trying to do is, of course, assuage the old school fiscal hawks and assuage some of the moderates and the centrists. But, Trump's not up for re-election again. But even if he was, and we've seen this over the last decade, every time Republicans get caught in a box of their making or Trump's making, they get the blame. Trump never gets the blame as the party's leader, and he never gets the blame as the guy who told Republicans in Congress to do the thing that Republican voters have decided they don't like.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mary Ellen, I know you've been thinking a lot about Tom Tillis since he announced that he was not going to run again. Can you talk a little bit? He's sort of the one, I think, who's most visible in this kind of bind that we're talking about. Caught between a rock and a hard place and has just decided he's had enough. Tell us what you're kind of thinking about him.
Yeah, it was a pretty dramatic turn of events. When the Senate resumed its debate on the floor this weekend on this bill, Tom Tillis, stood up a couple of times and interjected his opposition to these Medicaid cuts. He is a very conservative Republican from North Carolina. He's a two-term senator. He has been an ally of Donald Trump, but he's also been, an open-minded critic. He's a former Speaker of the House in North Carolina, so he's got some gravitas in a way that he's used to kind of speaking his mind. So North Carolina is the most recent state to expand Medicaid. And in order to do it, Republicans had to get on board pretty aggressively. And that kind of bipartisanship led to the kinds of expansions and the pieces in place that have allowed North Carolina to now cover, 663,000 people who otherwise would not have health care coverage. The bill in time would eliminate coverage for all those people. And he warned that if those cuts take effect, that is a betrayal, because Donald Trump said repeatedly that he's not going to touch Medicaid. So he warned the Republican Party a couple times on the floor. When he warned them, Donald Trump, came right out and basically blasted Tillis, and was critical of Tillis. And so on Sunday, Tillis announced that he is not going to seek re-election. Apparently, he had been considering stepping back and exiting the Senate when his term expires next year, but this was the final blow. And it's interesting because Republicans have long condemned the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. In Trump's first term, they tried to repeal it, but they've never offered any serious alternative. And this continues to be the case. These Medicaid cuts are essentially the equivalent of repealing the Affordable Care Act. And so I think this throws the problem back to the states. It opens up the same number of possibilities for uninsured and uncompensated care that will put pressure on rural hospitals. The warning is that over 300 rural hospitals may close. And those are the things that Tom Tillis, I think, fears are going to be lasting repercussions for his party and the implications of Trump's tenure. Now, David may be absolutely right that people never equate this to Donald Trump. But I think and it's very likely that is the case, since Democrats have proven to be such poor messengers of helping connect the dots on these things. But it's really going to be a question of how is this messaged in the end?
Yeah, the one survey I saw out yesterday said that only 8% of Americans have heard of the Medicaid cuts, for example. 8. That's not even 1 in 10. So the message, people have just tuned it out, I think, or the message has not reached them. One other issue we haven't devoted a lot of time to today yet is the deficit and the impact on the deficit. And that has proven, that's alarming to some parts of the, I think, financial sector. It's alarming to some parts of the Republican coalition. It's alarming to people like Elon Musk, who is out saying that he's going to start a new political party and try to primary all the people who voted to expand the deficit. This is an issue that I think people kind of tune out, because sometimes it's like the boy who cried wolf. People are always alarmed about deficits, but the sky never falls. But I wonder if there's a sense that this deficit expansion is so big that it might be different than the others. David, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, politically, not yet. I always like to joke that people will care about the debt when one day an American president goes on television and tells everybody that nobody's getting their check next week unless Congress and the White House work together to take drastic action to reform entitlement programs, which, I think many people don't realize are on autopilot, right? Like all the discretionary spending, all the defense spending has to be reauthorized every year. You need appropriations bills every year. Medicare and Social Security are on autopilot, and they just keep going up. And I'm not saying that they're not necessary. I'm not saying that people didn't pay in and shouldn't get, what they were promised. All I am saying is that it is because of demographic changes in the United States over the past couple of generations, where people are living longer, they're having fewer children. We don't have the same amount of people putting money into the program in their working years to support the retirees who are living longer in their elderly and senior years. And nobody wants to do anything about it. And I like to say that politicians are in the service business, right? Ideology and philosophy is their approach to fixing problems or crafting legislation. but they will do things that they either know or think voters want them to do. Get upset because the debt's at $37 trillion and the bond markets are jittery and interest rates are high, so our borrowing costs are going up, and that's eating into discretionary spending. They'll work on it, but they're not, because they don't think anybody cares, because nobody's asking them to do it, and they're afraid to go to the voter and say that we're going to have to make some changes. And by the way, just as a final coda on this, you would know that people cared if they said, it's okay if you raise my taxes. It's okay if you cut programs to at least some degree that impact me. Everybody, by and large, wants to tax the rich, quote unquote. In other words, go after the guy with the money. Don't impact me. Take his program. That's pork. That's unnecessary. Don't take mine. I'm against socialism. Don't take my Medicare and Social Security. And look, when George W. Bush and then Paul Ryan after him tried to reform Social Security only for people under 50 years old that weren't going to get it for years, there was a hue and cry, and the system broke down. Paul Ryan also, again, you can say his ideas were bad, but it wasn't just that. Nobody said, hey, really good idea, don't like your plan, but what about this plan? He also wanted to reform Medicare and Medicaid for later recipients, right? People like me at the time that weren't going to, we're decades away from it, and now I'm a little closer to it, but still got some time. And nobody would touch it. Right? There were ads where Paul Ryan was throwing Granny off a cliff. A congressman from Florida, Alan Grayson, when they said Republicans want you to die quickly. I'm not criticizing Democrats here and defending Republicans, because Republicans are doing the same thing. They're not doing anything about this because they don't think anybody wants them to. And the truth is, nobody does want them to. Maybe that'll change at some point, but it hasn't yet.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems true. I think also voters don't always connect increasing deficits to increasing borrowing costs for them personally. I think people want home mortgage rates to go down. That's unlikely to happen if the cost of borrowing is rising, and the cost of borrowing will rise if the United States takes on larger deficits. So that's a very wonky topic to a lot of people, and they don't necessarily connect those dots, and no one wants their taxes to go up. Mary Ellen,
I get that.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, do you have thoughts on that piece of it?
Well, I was just going to say that in addition to raising the debt $3.3 trillion, at least in the Senate bill, it does expand the debt ceiling. And I don't know, is that 5 trillion? It's something like that.
A big number.
Yeah. So, we have a $37 trillion national debt, and under this bill, it could go up to 42. I mean, so those problems are just being kicked down the road yet again, which just means, they're just afraid of, our political system is just incapable of addressing this.
I'm wondering, no one likes to make a prediction, but here we are on July 1st. Trump has said he wants this to be signed by July 4th. That's quite close. Do you guys think he's going to make it, David?
I mean, as I've written for Bloomberg Opinion, he will make it eventually. I've always felt that July 4th was ambitious, but it's only July 1st. So I hate these sort of predictions. If you forced me into it, I would bet not July 4th, but definitely in time for members to get out of town for the August recess. That'll give them basically another month to iron out their differences on this and figure it out. But it's still possible.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, what do you think?
Well, practically, I think it's really, really heavy lift. I mean, the Senate went almost all night last night. They made virtually little public progress. This bill still has to go back to the House. Admittedly, there are not a lot of competitive House seats, but there are enough of them to tank this. So I think practically it's impossible. However, I also think that I have watched these Republicans do things that are absolutely against their own interests just to help Donald Trump. And so I leave that as a possibility, that just because he's got some really ridiculous deadline that's self-imposed, that maybe they'll do it. On the other hand, it is the July 4th weekend. Nobody is paying attention. So the fact that anybody will really care that they missed the deadline is pretty low.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for joining us today and walking us through this Byzantine bill. And thank you to everyone who watched and joined us this morning. That's all for today. We'll see you again soon.